Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at The Trial of Socrates by I.F. Stone. This book was published in 1988, and I.F. Stone was born in 1907, so he was 81 years old when he published this book. And he had been writing books for a long time. His first book seems to have come out in the 1930s. So, he wrote books for a long period of time. And this is a pretty good one, I have to say. I like it. Of course, I have to say up front that I.F. Stone is a liberal progressive, and some of that comes through in the book. But it's pretty fairly written. It's not a liberal progressive polemic. It's a careful study of Socrates and his trial and the accusations against him and the merits or lack thereof of those accusations. I talked a little bit about Socrates' trial, not very much, but a little, in Richard Weaver's book, In Defense of Tradition. And Weaver argues that the charges against Socrates, or the trial of Socrates, was not entirely unwarranted, that Socrates had been potentially undermining the beliefs of the city of Athens, the people of Athens, in a way that weakened the authority of the leadership of Athens and undermined the culture of Athens, I guess would be the better way to phrase that. And so Weaver had a few criticisms of Socrates that I tended to agree with. And Stone has a few criticisms of Socrates as well. One of the things that drew me to this book was that he's not just reciting Plato and agreeing with everything that Plato says and everything that Socrates says. Oftentimes, you get this a lot where people just sort of assume that Plato's right about everything. He knows everything. Socrates knows everything. The sophists were morons. And I think the sophists get a bad rap. I mentioned that in my book about the sophists. This book kind of reiterates some of that we're seeing everything through the eyes of Plato, who's arguing against the sophists, and we don't get an awful lot of the sophists' side of the story. This book supports the sophists in a way that a lot of modern thinkers refuse to do, and criticizes Plato and Socrates in a way that a lot of modern thinkers refuse to do. Now, I.F. Stone is not echoing every argument that Richard Weaver made. Richard Weaver is a conservative, and he criticizes Socrates from a more conservative direction. But there is some crossover in their criticisms, and there's some, new criticisms in this book that Weaver doesn't make. He's not. The author here, Stone, is not completely and totally anti-Socrates, but he is pretty critical for the most part. And I think it's interesting. Again, I don't agree with every criticism made of Socrates by Stone, but I agree with a lot of them. And while I can definitely see there's a liberal, progressive aspect to the criticisms, they're fair. They're fair criticisms. But some of his criticisms are like that Socrates, the charges brought against Socrates had some degree of legitimacy to them. But part of his argument also is simply that Socrates was sort of a conservative, and that is adequate for criticism. That's a cause of criticism for Stone, and that is a part of the the criticism that the city of Athens made, or that the people who brought the trial against Socrates made, was in a way that Socrates was not pro-democracy. He was more pro-oligarchy, as we talked about in recent previous episodes from Thucydides, talking about the Peloponnesian War. The Peloponnesian War was happening during Socrates' lifetime. Socrates actually fought in the Peloponnesian War. And the Peloponnesian War was, in many ways, a war between pro-democrats and pro-oligarchs. And Socrates fought for Athens, so he fought for the pro-democrats. But that was because he was from Athens, and he was fighting for his home city. So it wasn't just an ideological war. It was a war of one city against another, Athens against Sparta. But there were undertones of war between ideological sides as well, as we talked about in the previous two episodes. But Socrates is not really, when it comes down to it, a Democrat. He's not pro-democracy. Now, we have to keep in mind that we're getting Plato's view of Socrates, and we're also getting Xenophon's view of Socrates, who was much less prolific than Plato was. So we've got a couple different perspectives, and it's widely acknowledged that Plato's putting some of his own words into Socrates' mouth, and I'm sure Xenophon does the same to some extent. Their visions of Socrates are not exactly alike. So part of the criticism here is that Socrates is not a Democrat. He's not pro-democracy. He criticizes democracy. Whether that alone justifies charges and ultimately justifies the death penalty, that's quite a stretch. But I'll get into that a little bit here and there in my analysis of this book. Like all my episodes, we've got a few sections I want to read. 8 sections, actually. Mostly about Socrates, but I also, toward the end of the episode, I do want to talk a little bit about the Greek gods. One of the charges against Socrates was that he did not believe in the gods of the city, and he tried to introduce new gods into the city, and that was sort of a no-no back then. So I'm going to jump in here and read a little bit from the first chapter, where the author says, quote, "The politicos, the political leader or statesman in a polis, was an elected official, subject to a limited term, usually a year, in office, answerable in a popular assembly and the popular jury courts for the conduct of his office, and invested, even in time of war, with far less than absolute power. The citizens he led were not his inferiors in legal status or rank, but, as Aristotle observed in his Politics, equal and like. They shared a common humanity. Here lay the first and most fundamental of the conflicts between Socrates and Athens. The various followers of Socrates disagreed, often as violently as modern scholars, as to just what Socrates had taught them, even and especially on the nature of virtue. But on one matter they agreed. They all rejected the polis. They all saw the human community not as a self-governing body of citizens with equal rights, but as a herd that required a shepherd, or king. They all treated democracy with condescension or contempt. Xenophon's ideal, as set forth in his own Utopia, the Cyropaedia, or Education of Cyrus, was monarchy under law. This was the Persian model, as Xenophon imagined its establishment by Cyrus the Great, founder of the Persian Empire. Antisthenes, the oldest disciple of Socrates, considered monarchy the ideal form of government, and agreed with Xenophon that Cyrus was the ideal monarch. These views were presumably expressed in his lost dialogue, The Statesman, mentioned by Athenaeus. Antisthenes was the founder of cynicism, and he was especially cynical about democracy. Two stories gibing at it are attributed to Antisthenes, one by Diogenes Laertius, the other by Aristotle. In the first, Antisthenes is supposed to have asked the Athenians why they did not vote that asses were horses, since, as he said, they sometimes elected generals who had as little resemblance to real commanders as an ass did to a horse. This satirical comparison may have originated with Socrates himself, since in Plato's Phaedrus, Socrates speaks of a popular orator palming off an ass as a horse on an ignorant city. Aristotle, in his Politics, attributed to Antisthenes a sardonic fable about the lions and the hares. When the hares made speeches in the assembly and demanded that all should have equality, Antisthenes related, "The lions replied, 'Where are your claws and teeth?'" This was the cynical reply to the democratic demand for egalitarianism. Plato sketched several utopias. All but one of them, the Laws, was based on one form or another of monarchy. In the Politicos, or Statesman, as we have seen, the ideal rule was absolute monarchy. In the Republic, it was absolute rule by one or several philosopher kings. In the Timaeus and its sequel, the Critias, Plato pictured the golden age of man as a time when the gods tended their human herds as men later tended their cattle. Even in the moderate utopia of Plato's old age, the Laws, the narrowly restricted citizen body would have operated under the watchful eye of a nocturnal council, an inquisitorial body empowered to root out dissent, the archetype of our late but unlamented House Un-American Activities Committee. Travel abroad was severely restricted to keep the community from spiritual pollution, as the Chinese communists now say, by foreign ideas. These Platonic innovations in thought control went beyond any kingship the Greeks had ever known. They were, in fact, the first sketches of what we now call totalitarian societies. End quote. So, yeah, like I was saying, there were a few people who followed Socrates, Xenophon, Plato, and also Antisthenes, and they all related what Plato said slightly differently, but none of them supported democracy. None of Plato's disciples were Democrats. They all had criticisms of democracy, and they all Xenophon and Plato sketched out a sort of utopia. And these visions of utopia are always some form of monarchy or otherwise anti-democratic. The Laws, he says, the moderate utopia of Plato's old age, the Laws. Now, we don't really know, but I think it's largely assumed that the Laws, one of Plato's dialogues, was written at a later date, and it's more moderate. It's not as idealistic, and we'll look at that in a future episode a little bit. But suffice to say that even in the more moderate Laws, it's not really just a regular democracy. There's a nocturnal council. There's a sort of secret police that roots out dissent and keeps everything in line. Kind of a hidden group behind the curtain that keeps everything in order. And it would be protected from travel and protected from spiritual pollution, protected from foreign ideas. So it's not just this free society. Plato doesn't advocate for this free society. And there have been many people, Karl Popper and others, who have criticized Plato on these grounds that, especially with the Republic, that he's really advocating for a sort of totalitarian society. I've mentioned that in previous episodes, like the Cave in the Light, that Plato was advocating for a sort of totalitarianism in the Republic. If you read it, it's kind of surprising, some of the things that he advocates for. And it's kind of surprising that in the modern era, the Republic is taken so seriously when most people, I think, if it came down to it, really wouldn't want to live in the world that Plato is proposing. So continuing on with this line of thought. He talks about Socrates as a monarchist, and he says, quote, Socrates laid it down as his basic principle of government in the Memorabilia that it is the business of the ruler to give orders and of the ruled to obey. Not the consent of the governed, but their submission was required. This was, of course, an authoritarian principle most Greeks, and particularly the Athenians, rejected. Fundamental to all the Greek city-states was the equality of the citizenry, whether restricted to the few or the many. The Socratic premise was a basic inequality. Nobody was a citizen, all were subjects. A gulf separated the ruler from the ruled. In one respect, the Socrates of Xenophon differs from the Socrates of Plato. In Xenophon's Memorabilia, Socrates advocates kingship within the limits of law, but in Plato's Republic, Socrates imposes no such restriction upon the philosopher kings. This may reflect the differences between the two disciples. Absolutism is the hallmark of the Platonic utopias, whereas Xenophon, in the Education of Cyrus, puts forward as his ideal a kingship exercised within the bounds of law. Xenophon and Plato may have heard Socrates differently on the subject, in accordance with their own preconceptions, as disciples so often do. At one point in Xenophon's Memorabilia, Socrates even speaks not only of law, but of popular consent as necessary ingredients of a true monarchy. Xenophon wrote that Socrates distinguished between kingship and despotism by saying that the government of men with their consent and in accordance with the laws of the state was kingship, while government of unwilling subjects, and not controlled by laws but imposed by the will of the ruler, was despotism. But what if a lawful king began to act lawlessly? Did his subjects then have a right to overthrow him, as a ship owner might discharge a pilot who had become alcoholic, or a patient change a physician who had abused his trust? Socrates is forced to confront the problem of what to do about a bad ruler or one who turns bad. After he has just laid down the proposition that it is the business of the ruler to give orders and of the ruled to obey, two questions are put to him. What if the ruler disregards good advice? What if he kills a loyal subject who dared to give him such advice? Socrates is evasive and answers with a question of his own. How can the ruler refuse when a penalty waits on disregard of good counsel? All disregard of good counsel is bound surely to result in error, and his error will not go unpunished. To the second question about killing a loyal subject, Socrates offers a similar reply. Do you think, he asks, that he who kills the best of his allies suffers no loss, or that his loss is trifling? Do you think that this conduct brings him safety, or rather swift destruction? These simplistic replies would have satisfied few of his contemporaries. What Socrates did not say is more impressive than what he did say. Nowhere does he affirm the right of citizens to get rid of a ruler who rejects good advice and kills those who offer it. He asks them to rely, like a free market theorist, on the supposedly inevitable consequences of bad judgment and misconduct. The destruction, Socrates predicts, for the bad ruler is no consolation to the ruled. The city and the citizens may be destroyed, along with the stubborn and willful ruler. Or he may decamp, like a Marcos or a Duvalier, with the wealth he stole from his subjects. Tyrants all too often get away with their plunder. Socrates thinks like a loyal monarchist. His basic view is expressed at another point in the Memorabilia when he asks why, in Homer, King Agamemnon is called shepherd of the people. Answering his own question, he replies, because a shepherd must see that his sheep are safe and fed. The good shepherd does indeed see that his flock is safe and fed, and to that degree there is a common interest uniting them, but the ultimate purpose of the shepherd is to shear the sheep for their wool and eventually to sell them for mutton. The herd is destined for the meat market, and the sheep are not consulted by the shepherd when he decides their time has come. The lesson the Greeks drew from the shepherd analogy is that the sheep cannot trust their shepherd, nor a community entrust itself to one man's absolute will, however benevolent he claims his purpose to be. They preferred to become a polis, rather than be treated as a herd. By the time of Socrates, kingship had disappeared from the Greek city-states and lived on only among the barbarians or in semi-barbarous areas like Macedonia. Aristotle, surveying the Greek city-states 2 generations after the death of Socrates, could say, "There are now no royalties. Monarchies, where they exist, are tyrannies." In Sparta, which the Socratics admired, the one Hellenic city-state in which there were still hereditary kings, their authority had dwindled to no more than that of military commanders in time of war. Even then, they had to operate under the watchful eye of annually elected ephors or overseers, Sparta's highest executive officers. And there were 2 kings from 2 different royal families. Division of authority and rivalry kept them in check. End quote. So there you see Socrates makes this sort of argument that, well, there will be natural negative consequences if a ruler rejects good advice, if a ruler kills the person who offers him good advice, if the ruler is not a smart man or not a good ruler or a tyrant or in some other way doesn't serve the city well, ultimately reality will break through, and if he's not an effective ruler, he'll be destroyed. But Stone says, well, what about the rest of the city? If the king's idiocy causes the downfall of the city, it's not just the king suffering the consequences of his own actions. The whole city has to wind up suffering under the leadership of a bad king. And Socrates never really addresses this point. And he compares the people to a herd of sheep that are safe and fed by a wise shepherd. He says King Agamemnon is called shepherd of the people. But I Have Stone here says, well, wait a minute. Actually, the shepherd is ultimately going to shear the sheep of their wool and sell them to the meat market, sell them to the butcher to be sold for meat. And so the sheep can't trust the shepherd, and people shouldn't trust their kings. If the king plans on treating the people in the same way that a shepherd treats the herd, the people are perfectly legitimate in saying, well, no thanks. We'd rather not get sold off for our tasty morsels. We would rather be self-ruling. We would rather be a polis, and we would rather have a say in our government. We would rather have an assembly that makes decisions rather than a king. So moving on from there, we begin to talk about a little bit out of politics and a little bit deeper into philosophy, but there is, of course, political implications to various philosophical positions. And so here he says, quote, "We now come to a second basic divergence between Socrates and his city. This concerned 2 questions that for Socrates, though not for the city, were inextricably interrelated. One was, what is virtue? The only definition of virtue Socrates ever ventured in his many fruitless attempts to define it was to equate virtue with knowledge. This raised the second question, what is knowledge? These are, of course, fundamental problems of philosophy, and they are still being debated unresolved. They may seem distantly abstruse and obscurely metaphysical, and best left to be wrestled with by candidates for PhDs. But they had inexplicable political implications. If virtue was knowledge, then presumably, like other forms of knowledge, it was teachable. And if it was teachable, then it could not be limited to a few, the old landed aristocracy, but could be learned by the many, the rising middle class of traders and craftsmen, and even to the common people. If they shared in virtue, then the many qualified for and could not be denied a share in governing the city. But Socrates, in dealing with the question, what is knowledge, went off in an opposite direction. Real knowledge, Socrates taught, could be obtained only through absolute definition. If one could not define a thing absolutely, then one didn't really know what it was. Then Socrates demonstrated that such knowledge was unobtainable, even by him. Modestly, he claimed that, in this sense, all he knew was that he didn't know. Virtue was knowledge, but real knowledge was inaccessible. Even this much of the truth could be grasped only, if at all, by a very few. So, behind his immeasurable modesty, there lurked an equally immeasurable conceit. It followed, at least for Socrates and his disciples, that since virtue was knowledge, and knowledge was unattainable, ordinary men, the many, had neither the virtue nor the knowledge required for self-government. By this labyrinthine metaphysical route, Socrates was back to his fundamental proposition that the human community was a herd and could not be trusted to govern itself. To understand the contrasting Athenian view, which was the general Greek view in the time of Socrates, the basic premise of his ethics, as of his politics, is that virtue is arete politici. The first word means virtue, and the second word means political. But the better English equivalent, as we have seen, is civil or social. For Aristotle, as for most Greeks, every citizen possessed by his very nature as a social animal those elementary virtues required for communal life. He didn't have to be a master of metaphysics, but he had to have that necessary modicum of reason, the logos, and with it, the ability to distinguish right from wrong. The political virtue gave men a sense of justice and sufficient consideration for the rights of others, to make the polis, the civilized community, viable. Of course, then as now, not everybody measured up to this requirement, but most did. Otherwise, even the primitive community could not have come into being and grown into a city-state. This was the basic ethical premise of the Greek polis, whether its citizenship was restricted to a relative few or extended to all free-born males. By refusing to recognize this modicum of basic virtue and of basic knowledge, the Socratic teaching struck the very core, the necessary premise, of the polis. The dominant Greek view gave dignity to the common man. The Socratic view demeaned him. This was an irreconcilable divergence. This divergence is reflected in the antagonism between Socrates and the so-called sophists. The sophists claimed to be teachers of knowledge and virtue. If Socrates was right, they were impostors, for neither knowledge nor virtue was teachable. The many could hope to attain neither. Their definition even eluded the grasp of the select few, including, by his own cheerful admission, Socrates himself. The antagonism between Socrates and the sophists, as portrayed in Xenophon and Plato, has blackened their name. Until then, the term sophistes had a complimentary, not a pejorative, connotation. In Homer, a sophy denoted a skill of any kind. The word sophistes came to mean a skilled workman or artist, and was soon also applied to diviners, poets, and musicians. The legendary 7 wise men of Greece were called sophistai, as were the pre-Socratic philosophers. It became an honorable appellation again in the Roman Empire for teachers of Greek rhetoric and philosophy. There is a strong element of class prejudice in the Socratic animosity toward the sophists. They were teachers who found their market in democratic cities like Athens, among a rising class of well-to-do craftsmen and traders whose wealth had enabled them to acquire arms. Their participation as hoplites, or heavily armored infantry, in the defense of the city had also won them a share in political power. They wanted to be able to challenge the old landed aristocracy for leadership by learning the arts of rhetoric and logic, so they could speak effectively in the assembly. They wanted to share in the arts and culture of the city. The sophists served as their teachers." End quote. So we can see here a little bit of the conflict between the sophists and Socrates, and it really comes down to the question of virtue and knowledge. And really it comes down to the question of virtue. What is virtue? And secondly, what is knowledge? And virtue remains largely undefined. Knowledge remains undefined. And the question really is, can virtue be taught? So the premise that Socrates makes is that virtue is knowledge. So one would think that if virtue is knowledge, then like most knowledge, it's teachable. But if it's teachable, then it could be taught to anybody. It could be taught to the middle class. Whereas in another view, which Socrates may or may not take, virtue is and knowledge are things that are in the hands of the upper classes. If the aristocracy has virtue, but the common man doesn't, because that's just the way things are, and the common man is not able to acquire virtue or knowledge, because virtue is a form of knowledge and knowledge is not teachable, then in that case, the people who have it naturally, the upper classes, should rule. But if political virtue and wisdom and capacity is teachable, or could be possessed, at least hypothetically, by all of the citizens of a polis, then the case for democracy becomes much stronger. So whether virtue is teachable or not is really an important political question and not just a philosophical abstraction. Can people be taught to manage the polis? Can people be taught to have the qualities necessary to effectively manage the polis? That's the question at the core here. If they are teachable, if virtue is teachable and the common man can be taught virtue and can be taught political wisdom, then the common man deserves a say. And so it's a philosophical question, but it's a political question as well. It has political implications. And the sophists are teachers of virtue and wisdom and rhetoric. And the sophists can provide these services to the rising middle class. People who have made money as craftsmen or as traders can afford to pay for sophists to teach them or their children to be effective in the assembly and how to gain and wield power effectively. So whether or not virtue can be taught has an implication for whether or not the sophists are frauds. So let's move on from there to where he talks about the foundational myth of democracy, which is a pretty interesting section here. He says, quote, "Never in Xenophon, and only once in the many dialogues of Plato, is the case for democracy stated and Socrates confronted with it. But instead of picking up the challenge and giving us his reply, Socrates evades the issue and takes us off instead into a semantic fog. This occurs in the Platonic dialogue that bears the name of Protagoras. Protagoras was the most famous of the rival teachers and philosophers whom Socrates and Plato stigmatized as sophists. Athens in the 5th century BC was an open market for ideas. Teachers flocked to it from all over Greece, attracted by a prosperous middle class eager for culture and philosophy. Protagoras is the only one of them who is treated respectfully in the Platonic dialogues. He was a close friend of Pericles, and when the latter established a model colony at Thurii in 443, he chose Protagoras to write its code of laws. Protagoras, as Plato himself so often did, sometimes put forward his ideas in the form of a myth. The myth of Protagoras in the Platonic dialogue of that name embodies the basic premise of a democratic society. The exposition of this myth was provoked in the dialogue by a speech in which Socrates speaks contemptuously of the Athenian assembly. Socrates says to Protagoras that when the assembly, the governing body of the city, has to deal with a construction project, it sends for builders to advise it. If its naval fleet or merchant marine is to be expanded, the assembly sends for shipwrights. The assembly depends on trained and professional experts. If a non-expert tries to speak up, no matter how handsome and wealthy and well-born he may be, the assembled citizens merely laugh him to scorn. But when it meets to debate basic issues of government, Socrates says, the man who rises to advise them on this may equally well be a smith, a shoemaker, a merchant, a sea captain, a rich man, a poor man, of good family or of none, and nobody thinks of casting in his teeth his lack of instruction or training in the matter under discussion. This struck at the very basis of Athenian democracy, as initiated almost 2 centuries before, when the great Athenian lawgiver and social reformer Solon gave all male citizens, including the poorest, the right to vote in the assembly and in the jury courts. To appreciate just how revolutionary an event this was, we need only recall that men without property did not win the right to vote in Western Europe until the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Even in the United States, men without property did not win the right to vote, even in the North, much less the oligarchic slaveholding South, where they remained poor white trash, until the 1820s and 1830s, the so-called Jacksonian Revolution. Protagoras replied to Socrates' criticism of every man's right to speak in the assembly with a fable or myth about the origins of civilized life. Protagoras said that when man was first created, he lived a solitary existence and was unable to protect himself and his family from wild animals stronger than he was. Consequently, men banded themselves together to secure their lives by founding cities. But the cities were torn with strife, because their inhabitants did wrong to one another, for they did not yet have the art of politics that would have enabled them to live peacefully together. So men began to be scattered again and to perish. Protagoras said that Zeus feared that our race was in danger of utter destruction. So he sent his messenger, Hermes, down to earth with 2 gifts, which would enable men at last to practice the art of politics successfully, and establish cities where they could live together in safety and in amity. The 2 gifts Zeus sent down to men were eidos and dike. Eidos is a sense of shame, a concern for the good opinion of others. It is the shame a soldier feels in betraying his fellows on the battlefield, or a citizen if he is caught doing something dishonorable. Dike here means respect for the rights of others. It implies a sense of justice, and it makes civic peace possible by settling disputes through adjudication. In acquiring eidos and dike, men would at last be able to ensure their survival. But before Hermes set out to Earth, he asked Zeus a crucial question, and the answer Zeus gave is the point of the myth of Protagoras. Am I, Hermes asked Zeus of eidos and dike, to deal them out as the other arts have been dealt? To understand the question, one must keep in mind that arts, in this quotation, is an inadequate translation of the Greek word techne, from which our words technique and technical are derived. For the ancient Greeks, techne included much more than what we call arts. It included all the crafts and professions, high and low, from the shoemaker and smith to the physician and sculptor. Hermes reminds Zeus that the other arts were given out in such a way that one man possessing the medical art is able to treat many ordinary men, and so on with the other craftsmen. Hermes asked Zeus whether he was to give out all the political art to a select few or to all. The answer of Zeus was the democratic answer. "To all," is his reply. "Let all have their share of the civic art. For cities cannot be formed," Zeus explains, "if only a few possess eidos and dike. All must share them to make communal life possible." To drive the point home, Zeus further instructs his messenger, "And make thereto a law of my ordaining, that he who cannot partake of respect eidos and right dike shall die the death of a public pest." Then Protagoras draws the moral of his myth. "Hence it comes about, Socrates," Protagoras says, "that people in cities, and especially in Athens, listen only to experts on matters of special expertise, but when they meet for a consultation on political art, i.e., on a general question of government, where they should be guided through by justice and good sense, they naturally allow advice from everybody, since it is held that everyone should partake of this excellence, or else that states, i.e., cities, the polis, cannot be." This was, to use a portentous modern term for it, the ideology of the Periclean Athens, in which Socrates grew up, but to which he was never reconciled. It is assumed that all men shared in what Protagoras called the political art, and therefore could be trusted and had a right to govern themselves. The myth of Protagoras may be read as the founding fable of democracy. End quote. So here we have a discussion about, that was a fairly long section, but about the Platonic dialogue of Protagoras. So what we have here is this is the only time, according to I.F. Stone, the only time that Socrates is really presented with some sort of argument in favor of democracy. Instead of just an endless army of yes men, Protagoras is not a yes man, and Protagoras makes the case for democracy by utilizing a myth. And the myth is essentially that there are two skills, two abilities, two attributes, eidos and dike, that enable people to get along with one another and form societies and build cities and be civilized. And these are eidos and dike, eidos being shame, dike being justice, more or less. We talked about eidos previously as well. I believe that was brought up in Carl Karenyi's book, The Religion of the Greeks and Romans. And eidos was a sort of religious quality as described by Karenyi, and it's acquired by humans by the gift of Zeus in this myth. So the idea here is that there are some skills, like being a doctor, that everybody doesn't have. One person may have this skill and other people don't. And the person who has it, who's the doctor, takes care of the people who don't have the skill and is paid for it, and other people have to go do something else, right? It's given out sparingly. Only some people can write tragedies. Only some people can create wine or whatever it may be. Whatever the particular skill is, only a few people have this skill, this technique. But when it comes to eidos and dike, Zeus says, if people are going to be able to form cities, we need to give it to everybody. Or pretty much everybody. If somebody doesn't have it, then they need to be killed. They need to suffer the death of a public pest. Everybody must have some degree of shame. They shouldn't behave shamelessly. They should be ashamed of themselves when they do bad things, when they do incorrect things, when they do embarrassing things, when they go against the norms. There should be a sense of shame in people to keep them in line. And people should have a sense of justice and right. And these should be distributed to everybody. Nobody ought to not have them because the polis depends on it. And this is the foundational myth of democracy, as I.F. Stone says. This is the idea that everybody should have a say in things. So when the assembly gathers and they need boats, they call the shipwright. When the assembly gathers and they want to build a temple, they contact architects and builders and so on. They want a sculpture, they contact a sculptor. But when they are making decisions about how they'll be governed, and when they're making decisions about the shape of the governmental structures and those things that the assembly decides what to do. Shall we build a temple? So when they decide that they're going to build a temple, they need the architect and the builder. They need to contact people with specialized knowledge. But the question of what shall we do? Shall we build the temple? Is a question that everyone gets to have a say in. And Socrates criticizes this. Why are you letting everybody have a say in the most fundamental and important questions about the shape of the state? What is the state going to look like? What are the priorities going to be? What are the gods that we'll worship? What are the festivals that we'll have? How shall things be run? These decisions of ultimate importance, are just given over to everybody to come along and make a speech in the assembly and try to convince people. And they're all going to get votes. They're all going to make these decisions. And we've seen the potential downside when we looked at the Sicilian expedition, which was a real bad choice because the common person may not know enough about military affairs to say whether it's a good choice. So the ability of the assembly to make decisions, according to Socrates, would really need to be limited more. Average people, less than average people, half the people in the world are below average. Dumb people get to come to the assembly and vote and make speeches and guide the city. And Socrates doesn't think that that's a good idea. There should be people who are trained and skilled who make the decisions. So Socrates is, again, not in favor of democracy, but the myth says everybody has the basic skills that are required, the basic virtues that are required for self-government. So let's move on from there a little bit. He talks a little more about the philosophy of Plato, and this, of course, ties in with the political philosophy. But he says, quote, Socrates carried the search for definition to the point of absurdity. There are passages in the Platonic dialogues that read as if they were lifted from some lost Aristophanic comedy. One is in the Theaetetus, where, grappling with the problem of knowledge, Socrates discusses shoemaking. The other is from the Phaedrus, where, in a similar search, he discusses horse trading. Socrates begins his argument in both dialogues with the truism that you cannot make a shoe without knowing what a shoe is, nor can you be a trader in horses without knowing what a horse is. But to know what a shoe or a horse is for the purpose of shoemaking or horse trading, is it also necessary to meet the impossible standards of Socratic logic by coming up with an absolute and perfect definition of either shoes or horses? Must the shoemaker or horse trader qualify for a PhD in metaphysics? Socrates demands not only perfect definitions of the shoe and the horse, but, more difficult, a perfect definition of knowledge itself. Here is how Socrates puts it to Theaetetus, who is perhaps the least wide awake of all these submissive yes-men given to Socrates in the Platonic canon. Socrates. Then he, the shoemaker, does not understand knowledge of shoes if he does not know knowledge. Theaetetus. No. Socrates. Then he who is ignorant of knowledge does not understand cobblery or any other art. Theaetetus. That is true. Any bright Athenian could have made the obvious objection to this stratospheric nonsense. A shoemaker need not be a philosopher, and a philosopher is not necessarily a good shoemaker. Indeed, the customer who brought a piece of leather to the cobbler was interested not, as a philosopher would say, in universals, but in particulars. He wanted a pair made to fit his particular feet, not some metaphysically perfect definition of a shoe. Then, as now, the right foot was not the same as the left, so no two shoes in the same pair were identical, however perfect the definition of shoe. And the customer wanted his particular pair made in such a way to best utilize the particular piece of leather he had chosen. At every point, the particular was more important than the universal. In one vital respect, the shoemaker is ahead of the philosopher. The shoemaker can make a shoe, but the philosopher still can't turn out an absolutely perfect definition either of shoes or of knowledge. Insofar as their respective crafts are considered, the shoemaker is clearly the better craftsman than the metaphysician. So with horse trading. In the Phaedrus, Socrates says how silly it would be if I should urge you to buy a horse and fight against the invaders, and neither of us knew what a horse was. An irreverent bystander might well have interrupted at this point to say that if neither Socrates nor Phaedrus knew what a horse is, they were obviously too low on the IQ scale to be of any use in the army anyway. As with shoemaking, the art of horse trading lies in the particulars, not in the universal. The first thing the horse trader would ask is what kind of horse you wanted. For war? For racing? For heavy work around the farm? Or a showy carriage horse for a holiday outing? Then, too, the canny buyer would take a good look at the horse's teeth, his legs, his hooves, before closing the deal. It was taken for granted that the buyer of the horse was not an idiot who could be palmed off with a zebra or an ass. From the common sense point of view, the profundities of metaphysics look straight out of cloud cuckoo land. Everybody knows what a horse is. Everybody, that is, except the philosopher. Yet this type of deceptive analogy and of semantic confusion was used by Socrates and his disciples to cover democracy with derision. Such analogies had anti-political implications. If occupations as humble as shoemaking or horse trading could not be carried on successfully without unattainable definitions, how could ordinary men be trusted to practice the far more complex art of governing their cities? Every disciple of Socrates may have drawn varying conclusions and differing systems of philosophy from their master's ambiguities, but all, without exception, drew such anti-democratic conclusions from them. Taken seriously, they would have brought the life of the city to a halt. End quote. So, we see here he does bring it back to the political again. This is really a book about the politics of Socrates and how it is bound up in the philosophy of Socrates. But he does point out that Socrates just kind of veers off into absurdity in a semantic fog in this attempt to acquire some sort of perfect definition, to the point where he doesn't know what a shoe is, he doesn't know what a horse is. He says neither of us, he's talking to Phaedrus, neither of us really know what a horse is. And the author says, well, if you don't know what a horse is, you're a moron. Everybody knows what a horse is except for the philosophers. And he says that people in their crafts are concerned with particulars. They're not concerned with universals. They're not concerned with the ultimate ideal shoe. They're concerned with the shoes that they're going to make for the customer in their store, with the leather that they have brought in, and the feet that are at the end of their legs. A particular person with particular feet, particular leather, in a particular situation, a particular horse for a particular purpose, and the realm of the universals is just not relevant to the average person. The ideal shoe, the ideal horse. These aren't things that occupy a lot of mental energy from average people, and they don't need to. And he also says that, look, if you want to, count things up here in the ledger, the shoemaker knows how to make shoes, and the horse trader knows how to trade horses. But the philosopher does not seem to know how to offer a definition of knowledge or of virtue or of anything else. Socrates says he doesn't know anything. Moreover, everyone he talks to seems to not know anything. And no satisfactory answer has been given even now, well over 2,000 years later. So, philosophy can be very useful and beneficial, but it also has the tendency to veer off into, as the author says, cloud cuckoo land, where the very premise of what is reality becomes distorted and lost in a haze of intellectual pursuits and imaginary things, mental quests that leave the real world behind. And the philosophers don't always come back with their arms full after their mental excursions. Many times they come back with their hands empty. They haven't figured anything out. So they should maybe have a little bit more humility. And this reminds me of common sense philosophy. So one more section before I get on to the gods. He's still talking about particulars here. He says, quote, "The problem is not that things constantly change, thus eluding absolute definition. The problem is also, as every judge in a law court knows, that circumstances may not only alter cases, as the lawyers say, but can challenge the applicability of principles that usually appear unshakable. This is true in dealing with Socrates' favorite theme, a definition of virtue. Socrates would surely agree that telling the truth is certainly basic to virtue. A liar is not a virtuous man. But is this always so? Can circumstances never alter even this basic proposition? Suppose you have a friend dying in a hospital who wonders why his beloved wife has not come to visit him in his final hours. Which is virtuous, to tell the poor fellow the full truth that she has run off with their handsome chauffeur, or soothe his mournful last hours with a sedative fiction? This is an extreme example, but extreme examples, as Socrates well knew, destroy perfect definitions. Our example shows how even the most fundamental notions of virtue and justice may depend in the instant case, as judges say, not on the universals Socrates sought, but on the particular circumstances. The fact that all laws and general propositions have their exceptions does not destroy the value of laws and generalizations as guides to human conduct, any more than the doctrine of justifiable homicide destroys the law against murder. But it does mean that in the agonizing choices with which real life so often confronts men and judges alike, true virtue, humanity, and kindness may call for bending the rules, sometimes considerably. The abstractions alone, no matter how ancient and venerable, sometimes prove insufficient. To decide when this is so may be painful and perilous. The law must be preserved, but justice must be done. And they are not always the same. The ancient conundrum of Greek tragedy and Socratic Platonic philosophy is still with us and always will be. End quote. So that's just some more about the concept of the particulars and applying it to morals, and the futility of trying to come up with a perfect moral law that must always be followed. To say, this is right, this is wrong. There's mitigating circumstances all the time. It's wrong to just walk up to someone and shoot them in the face for no reason. But if you're being attacked, perhaps it's right. If the person in question has murdered your family and gotten away with it, and you walk up to them and shoot them in the face, isn't it a little different? So the particular circumstances apply in moral questions, in questions of virtue. And the quest for a universal, perfect definition is a fruitless one. So let me jump from there. We've gotten a pretty good look at Socrates' politics, and also at the ways that his philosophy about knowledge and virtue and about universals and particulars can affect his political position and can imply a political position. So jumping into a little bit of a conversation about gods, one of the charges against Socrates was that he didn't believe in the gods of the city, and he was trying to bring in foreign gods. So while much of the case against him was animated by the fact that he was so anti-democratic, and Athens had been facing these continual problems with uprisings from oligarchs who didn't want to live in a democracy, and their supporters who wanted to return control back to ancient families and not to the common rabble. And there had been several situations. The 30, I believe they were called, of oligarchs. The 400 was a more expansive collection of oligarchs, but it still was a limited group of people in a fairly large city who had all the political power. And so there is at least some concept here that if they want to preserve their democracy and not go through additional revolutions and civil wars between the oligarchs and the Democrats, they had to firmly commit that Athens was on the Democrat side, so as to not have to deal with another round of insurgents trying to switch Athens to an oligarchic governmental system. So some sense of prudence and vigilance perhaps demanded that they have a conversation with Socrates and what he was teaching the youth and what he was teaching them about democracy. Of course, that conversation took the form of a trial in which they ultimately decided to execute him. But you can kind of get an eye into some insight here about why they did this. And was it just that they hated philosophy? No, it wasn't that they just hated philosophy in Athens. It was a little bit more complex than that. So regardless, here talking a little bit about the gods, he says, quote, "There was no law against atheism in ancient Athens, either before or after the trial. Indeed, the only place we find such a law proposed is in Plato's Laws. In this respect, Plato was the exception to the tolerance that paganism showed to diverse cults and philosophic speculation about the gods. Since paganism saw gods everywhere and of every kind, it was by its nature tolerant and incapable of imposing a rigid dogmatism. It easily accommodated a wide range of theological interpretation. At one end of the spectrum was a simple anthropomorphic and literal faith in the gods. At the other end was their transformation by the pre-Socratic philosophers into mere personifications of, or metaphors for, natural forces or abstract ideas. The gods disappeared into air, fire, water, and earth. Classical mythology invited this metaphysical metamorphosis by its very names for the aboriginal divinities, the primordial chaos, Kronos, later identified with Chronos or time, Oranos, the sky, and Mother Earth. From a theology of nature to a philosophy of nature was an easy transition, and it was difficult to draw a line between them. It was monotheism that brought religious intolerance into the world. When Jews and Christians denied divinity to any god but their own, they were attacked as atheos or godless. This explains how, to borrow Novalis' characterization of Spinoza, a God-intoxicated Jew and Christian like St. Paul could be called an atheist by pious and indignant pagans. The very word atheos had a different ring to it in classical antiquity than in the later Christian era. The word does not appear in Homer or Hesiod. It does not appear until the 5th century BC in Pindar and Greek tragedy. There it means godless or ungodly in the colloquial sense that we still use those words for the lawless and immoral. The Greek word could also mean abandoned by the gods or struck by their wrath. End quote. That was an interesting little section there where he basically says that the pagans were fairly tolerant, and they had to be because they saw gods everywhere, a multitude of gods. And when someone comes along telling stories of another god who is another one among the many, it was perceived as at least a reasonable proposition. Oh, this other god exists? Okay, well, we've got a whole bunch of gods. You've got a whole bunch of gods. Everybody's got gods. This other additional god exists. All right, let's have a look and see if we think that's worthy. Now, there was control over the religions of the state, but atheism as a concept wasn't really much of a thing. Because of the tolerance of the pagans, people had different interpretations. So what would now probably be considered more of an atheistic perspective was generally accepted. This idea that, well, it's really a description of natural forces, air, earth, fire, and water, the elements. The gods are just other names for the elements. Or the gods are other names for other natural phenomena or human modes of existence, types of human experience, aspects of human life. The gods are just personifications of things in the world. And this was not an uncommon view among the ancient world, the thinkers of the ancient world. And I find that fascinating. I think of the Statue of Liberty, which is a statue of an ancient Roman goddess, but Libertas is the name. But liberty is clearly a thing, a concept, a mode of being, a way of interacting with other people. Whatever you want to call it, it's a sort of concept other than a god. And so there's this real overlap of the gods and various concepts and various natural forces. And this comes right down to the most primordial gods and goddesses: chaos, earth, night, time, right? I mean, they're just like things, eros, love, right? They're gods of very specific carved out domains. And they could be considered just, it was not beyond the pale, let's say, to just consider them personifications of non-divine things in the world. And other people considered the gods absolutely 100% real entities that were human-shaped and lived in the world somewhere, or in a quasi-heaven-like state, or somehow the gods were real entities, and other people said they're really just metaphors. And all of this was really tolerated. It wasn't until Christianity came along and decided that there was only one God, and it was their God, and there was a very strict understanding of who this God is and what he believes and what he represents with Christ and the spread of Christianity. So anyway, let me keep moving when he begins to talk about the gods of the city. So he says, quote, "By trapping Miletus into calling him an atheist, Socrates evaded the actual charge in the indictment. It did not accuse him of disbelief in Zeus and the Olympian divinities, or in the gods generally. It charged disbelief in the gods of the city. This was, in the ancient Greek sense, a political crime, a crime against the gods of the Athenian polis. This is a crucial point, too often overlooked. What did the indictment mean by the gods of the city? A clue is provided by Xenophon in his Memorabilia. Twice he recalls that Socrates, when asked how to act piously toward the gods, quoted a saying by the priestess of Delphi, "Follow the nomos of the city. That is the way to act piously." Nomos means custom or law. The nomos was established by tradition, or later by legislative act. This was the standard Greek view. The city was the state, and the state determined which gods it specially venerated. It regulated religious practices, the rites, the temples, the sacrifices, and the festivals. Religion was a civic function, a reflection of its local ways and customs. The indictment said that Socrates did not conform to the nomos of his city, but it does not specify the beliefs Socrates did not share. Neither Xenophon nor Plato give us a clear answer, perhaps because such an answer would have lent more substance to the charge and weakened their defense of Socrates. A clue to the gods of the city problem is provided in the Oxford Classical Dictionary article on Hephaestus, the god of fire, and especially of the fire in the smithy. Here, the Oxford Classical Dictionary says, "He was for the Greeks a craftsman's god, and himself a divine craftsman." The pre-Socratic philosopher Xenophanes once observed that men make gods in their own image. The Ethiopians with crinkly hair, the Celts with red. The same tendency appeared in the various crafts. The smith created a god in his own image, as his patron divinity. The distribution of the Hephaestus cult in the Greek city-states was determined by the progress of metallurgy and industry. His cult, the OCD goes on, was practically confined to the most industrialized regions, being particularly prominent at Athens. As a city with a large concentration of craftsmen, and a city dependent in large part for its livelihood on the products of the smithy and the kiln, Athens would naturally include Hephaestus among its gods of the city. The prominence of Hephaestus as an Athenian god is shown, as the OCD suggests, by his frequent appearance in Athenian vase painting from the first half of the 6th century. It was in the same century that the craftsmen and traders began to win political equality. The cult of Hephaestus grew with the advance of democracy. The one unruined 5th century temple, the so-called Thesion, was really a temple of Hephaestus. From a low hill, it overlooked the agora. The patron goddess of Athens, the foremost divinity of the city, was Athena, the goddess of wisdom, born directly from the head of Zeus. Hephaestus appears on Athenian vases, assisting as a kind of male midwife in the delivery. There was a common worship among all Greeks for the Olympian deities of Homer, but even the great gods were worshipped under different forms and appellations in different cities. These special appellations, like the minor gods, were the subject of special civic cults, which symbolized the character of each city. In Athens, for example, Pallas Athena was worshipped not only as the goddess of wisdom, but in that capacity especially as a patron of the arts and crafts. For wisdom, Sophia, originally meant not just wisdom in our sense, but any special skill or knowledge, whether in forging metals, or weaving cloth, or treating the sick. But Socrates speaks with disdain for the craftsmen and traders who had begun to play so large a part in the assembly and the other democratic institutions of the city. As we have seen, the kind of society he admired was the Spartan, where the warrior landlords excluded craftsmen and traders from citizenship. In the Greek city-states, as in the Roman, not to recognize the city's gods was to be disloyal to the city. End quote. So here we get our first look at the gods of the city. And the idea here is that different Greek cities worshipped the gods differently. Sometimes they had other additional gods that were representative of activities that were local. Sometimes they had versions of existing gods that were unique to the city, with a special appellate like Pallas Athena. So they have different kind of manifestations of one god or another that's used with a secondary descriptor. And sometimes it was just a new god entirely that wasn't present in other cities. And he uses the example of Hephaestus, who was a god of metallurgy and blacksmithing and forging metals, the god of the forge, and the god of fire, but particularly in the context of the fires of the forge. And the cult of Hephaestus spread with the spread of metallurgy, unsurprisingly. And in this way, you can see that the gods kind of represent something more than just some anthropomorphic entity, but in a way represent the ideals of the city, the activities of the city, what the city respects, how the city sees itself. And this ties in with the other concept of the gods as like archetypes or ideals. And so the values of the city are reflected in the gods that the city chooses to worship and chooses to allow into its sort of local pantheon, and which gods it rejects. If a god is a god of something that the city doesn't want to welcome, they're not going to take that god on. And I think that's pretty fascinating. So the last section I'm going to read is a little bit more about the gods, and he talks about one specifically, one god of the city, who is Pytho, the goddess of persuasion. So he says, quote, "In 5th century Athens, Pytho had developed into a civic goddess of democracy, a symbol of the transition to rule by popular consent and consensus achieved by debate and persuasion. Her political stature was reflected in the Athenian theater. The unique character of Attic poetry, C.M. Bauer wrote, came from the Athenian democracy itself. Tragedy was performed with religious solemnity, before a vast, critical, amazingly intelligent audience. Such performance was, in every sense, a public event. In their personifications of Pytho, as a civic goddess of persuasion, the Athenians recast not only their religion but their mythology and history to suit the ideas of 5th century democracy. They even claimed, according to that most famous of ancient travelers, Pausanias, that the cult of persuasion was first instituted by Theseus, the mythical first king of Athens. This venerable genealogy was, of course, quite unhistorical. Perhaps the most striking references to Pytho in Attic theater are in the Frogs of Aristophanes in 405 BC, 6 years before the trial of Socrates. In that comedy, Aristophanes staged a debate between Aeschylus and Euripides in Hades. Euripides and Aeschylus hurl one-line quotations at each other about persuasion from their plays, some now lost. These must have been familiar, or the points made would not have been appreciated by the audience. Euripides begins with a line from a lost play he wrote about Antigone. In it, persuasion is associated with logos, reasoned speech. Euripides says that persuasion needs no shrine except logos, and adds that her altar is in the nature of man. Aeschylus counters Euripides with a quotation from a lost play of his own, the Niobe, in which he said that death alone is impervious to persuasion. Even Aristophanes, who jokes about everything and makes Dionysus himself the butt of the coarsest humor in the same play, makes no jokes about persuasion. That must have been the most extraordinary tribute of all to Pytho. A generation later, the two greatest masters of 4th century oratory, Demosthenes and Isocrates, also list Pytho among the gods of the city and refer to annual sacrifices in her honor. There is a statue of her near the Acropolis, and an ancient inscription tells us that her priestess had a special seat of honor in the temple of Dionysus. She was commemorated in sculpture by Praxiteles and Phidias. It could be significant that there is no reference to Pytho as a divinity anywhere in Xenophon or in Plato. They could hardly have venerated a civic goddess of the democracy they rejected. The Platonic contempt for persuasion and oratory, as practiced in a democratic polity, is summed up by Phaedrus in the dialogue that bears his name. "I have heard," he said, "that one who is to be an orator does not need to know what is really just, but what would seem just to the multitude, who are to pass judgment, and not what is really good or noble, but what will seem to be so." And he adds sardonically that persuasion comes from what seems to be true, not from the truth. Of course, oratory can be misleading as well as enlightening. The same is true of philosophy itself. Else why would philosophers so often and so bitterly disagree? But what better way to winnow out the truth than by free debate? End quote. So here, I think it's interesting. He's talking about Pytho, and Pytho really seems to have started out as just a concept, just a word that means persuasion, but over time took on characteristics of a deity and became the goddess of persuasion. And I think it's also interesting that I didn't really read the section. It's only mentioned very sparsely, but democracy herself, I believe the term used by the ancient Greeks is demokratia. I could be wrong on that, but the point is that democracy was represented as a goddess, the goddess of democracy, whose name was basically democracy. Pytho, meaning persuasion, is the goddess of persuasion. And again, we see that there is a clear overlap between gods and ideas. And the Greeks were not wholly unaware of this overlap, and it seems as though they steered it. They would craft their mythology to fit the gods and goddesses that they chose to worship because they wanted to represent their city in some certain way and having some certain values. And in order to sort of manifest and solidify those values, they were represented as deities. And just as an aside, I think it's interesting how the ancients would alter their mythology and alter the gods that they worshipped over time to reflect the changes in their way of life. And I think that's important when people try to recreate some sort of modern version of paganism and try to make it just exactly the way that it used to be. No changes. It has to be like this, and this. It's a perfect recreation of the way things used to be. But really the way things used to be is that they would fit the gods into the mold that they wanted, that they felt they needed. And so it wasn't that God created man in his own image, but that the people, man, created the gods in their image. And he talks about how the Ethiopians have gods that have crinkly hair. The Celts have gods that have red hair. If horses had gods, they would look like horses. Because the people craft the gods, create the gods, shape the gods to fit their ideals, to look like themselves, and to represent, at least in some cases, to represent what they value. So I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you again next time.